So you want to learn verse, but when you actually go ahead and try to do it, you get a bit overwhelmed on what everything means, like what is this or that, or oh look, there's 600 errors. In this tutorial, I will go over everything you need to know if you're an absolute beginner to verse. There's going to be some terms I use, like integer or boolean, that maybe some people who are not familiar with programming might not know what that is, but don't worry, I will try my best to make it understandable for you. Okay, let's start with the real basics. What even is verse? Taken from Epic themselves, verse is a programming language developed by Epic Games that you can use to create your own gameplay in the Unreal Editor for Fortnite, or UEFN for short, including customizing your own devices for Fortnite Creative. Some of the goals in the language are to be general or to be able to write basically any kind of code, productive in building and iterating on code, and performance, all while being simple enough for first-time programmers to understand, which could be you. Verse is also being constantly developed to add more features. Really, anything you write today should provide backward compatibility and work in future updates even when new features eventually get added to Verse. Even though this is a programming language where you can write all the stuff you want, there's one big important thing you need to keep in mind. Verse right now relies on all the Fortnite Creative's devices to function and do things. For example, to damage the player, you'll need a damage volume device, for example. Or if you wanted to heal a player, you need a health power-up device. Or if, let's say, you wanted to give the player an item, you would need something like an item granter device. To make Verse work, you need to understand Fortnite Creative's devices and know what they do to really get a hold of what you can make with Verse. I'll go over this later, but every device has referential functions or methods inside the Fortnite Verse digest. For example, in here, if I wanted to, I could use a button device. I can use pre-made functions like enable or listen to certain events like interact with event. The same functions and events you can find on the bottom of the details panel if you select any device in UEFN. Anywho, I will get into that later. Now, next up, we're going to actually make a Verse file. Okay, when you make a project in UEFN, you're gonna see the default blank project. Now, to actually get your Verse file, you want to go to the top here in the Verse. You want to go down to Verse Explorer and click on this. This will open a new tab over here where you can move it around if you want, but this is your Verse Explorer. And you can see all your Verse files. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to right click on our Verse tutorial, and then we're going to add a new Verse file project. Now in here, you can get NPC behavior, or let's say if you want to make NPC behavior. You can also use components too for the scene graph. But for now, we're going to use a Verse device, and we're going to call it, just call it anything for now. I'm just gonna give it default, and then we're gonna create it. If you go see here, you can see there's a little file now. If you click on this, or you click on this button up here, we're now inside of VS Code. Now, if you don't have VS Code installed, it's a Microsoft's code editor. So if you go into something, if you just go online, you can find the download for it. Or if you go in the Microsoft store, you should find it there. And then you want to download it. Okay, now this is what you see when you first open a Verse project. Okay, so I'm just gonna go for the real basic stuff, okay? And then we'll get to actually making a device. Okay, to start, let's do some syntax, which can be hard to wrap your head around, as it's a bit confusing if you've done other programming languages. It's very functional and very logic based. Remember, you need to write exactly how I write it, excluding spaces. You can put in spaces, whatever, and there's a few exceptions, but usually try to get the syntax exactly the same as what I'm going to do here. Now, firstly, let's just talk about indentation. Okay, so this would be our class, and then inside our class we have a function, but if we put it here, it's not going to work. So if you press tab, you're going to put it back to this tab. You see the line there, and then inside this function is where we put this one on the next tab over. And then let's say if we did like an if in here, blah 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 blah, and then we do this down here, we'll then tab in again, and that's inside the if statement, but we'll get into that later. Just remember that indentation in Verse is extremely important. Okay, to be honest, I'm just going to delete everything inside of here, and inside here I'm going to do some, we're going to learn some stuff. Okay, now in here I'm going to write something. This is called a constant. A constant is something that cannot be changed throughout the runtime. So it's constantly the same, hence the name constant. Now this number here is what is known as the identifier. That will identify our constant or whatever in the code. You can name it anything you like or whatever you feel is good to represent what you're trying to make, but just make sure you can have two of the same identifiers, and you also can't name it any keywords. So for example, something like void would be a keyword, or class would be a keyword. So don't name it that, or int. Next, after the identifier, we're going to do a little colon, and then we're going to write what type you want your identifier to be. There are many different types, one of them being int, which is short for integer. An integer is a whole number that can be positive, negative, or 0, but not fractional, so no decimals. So for example, 1 would be integer, 1.33 would not be an integer. And then after we define our type, we'll do equals, and then we'll do the value of our expression, or the real term for it is initializing the constant. Now, what if we want to change our constants during runtime? If I wanted to add one to number and make it so it's equal to 2. We can't do that because, as I said, a constant like this is a constant, cannot be changed. Now that's where variables come in. To make a variable, you just want to type var in front of any expression and it will turn it into a variable. Variables are pretty much just constants, except that we can change them throughout the runtime. So now we have just declared a variable named number, given a type of int or integer, and initialize the expression with the value of 1. Okay, now integer is only one type and there's a bunch of other types. So some other types you can use are as follows. Float, or floating point numbers, a fancy way of saying any number with a decimal point. Make sure if you ever use floats, even if the number is 1, it needs to have a decimal point, so it's 0.0. So a float is basically any number that is a decimal. Another type is string, and string is used for text. And you give the string type the text, and you would write text like this with the two quotation marks. And the last type you really need to know is logic, which is for Boolean values, which can only be ever true or false. And there's also a few others that we don't need to go over right now. Anyways, now you know about constants, variables, types, values, expressions, and what have you. Okay, now let's try to show this value of 1 on the output. So how would we do this? Well, if you go down to begin and get rid of these brackets, there's a built-in function in verse called print to print our number inside of the output. So if we put a number in here, what you're gonna notice using the number inside print doesn't work. This is because the print function only takes the type string, and number is not the type string, it is type int. So how would we get our integer as a string? We want to use two quotation marks, like if we're making a string. We'll then use a curly bracket, and then we'll put number inside of it. Doing this, we are using a little trick called string interpolation to be able to use our integer inside a string. Then with this also, we can do something like this, where we can do number of things equals number, and we can interpolate numbers inside of strings. Very handy, very handy. Now another thing we can do with strings is concatenate strings, aka just adding a string onto strings. We'll make a string called winning player name as type string, and we'll have player 1 as the little string for it. And then using that winning player name string we made, we can make another string called announcement, and we can then we can do and the winner is, and we can do plus winning player name, and then a little plus, which is like exclamation mark. So now we put player 1 inside of this little thing, so it's going to say and the winner is player 1 with that little thing at the end. So if you're wondering what this plus sign is, well, now it's time for operators. Now there's a lot of operators, so let's start with math. Now this is pretty easy if you went to school if you were 8. All I'm doing here is I'm getting my variable number, which is equal to 1, and then I'm going to add 1 to number, which is, going to be equal to 2. And you can do the same thing with, subtraction, multiplying, which is this little star. You use a little star for multiplying, and you use a forward slash for dividing. Okay, now here's a bunch of different ints I made, like apples, oranges, mangoes, bananas, and they have different counts. You can actually compare things like all of these apples and oranges using something called the if statement. If I write out if, do brackets, apples equal oranges, you do a little colon, then shift enter, we could do print, and then inside print we can do apples do equal oranges. Now we do a thing saying if apples equals oranges, we're gonna print apples do equal oranges. But then, and now this is important, if statements are failable. So for example, if the apples aren't equal to oranges. So to do this, we're going to go down to here. I'm going to do something special called else. We're going to do a colon, and then we're going to press go down. And now we're going to print. We're going to say apples do not equal oranges. So now on game start, it's going to check if apples are equal to oranges, and if it's not, it's going to print apples are not equal. And obviously apples are not equal to oranges, so this is going to print. Now equals is a comparison operator, and there's a few other ones we can use. There's greater than and equal to, less than or equal to, equal as we know, or not equal. You'll do this if it's, if you want to get not equal. Another thing we can do is we can use the and operator to do if apples are less than oranges and the mangoes are not equal to bananas. We can print whatever we want or do whatever we want down here, and then if this check fails, it's gonna do else, sorry. And then there's another operator we can also use beside and, is or, and or will check if either apples is less than oranges or mangoes is not equal to bananas. It's gonna print success. So or only needs one of them to come through to work, and if neither of them ever come through, it'll fail, and so you'll get the else. Here's another example of a variable called completed course with logic, and it's equal to false. And we can check if the completed course is equal to true, and we can print course completed, else we can say course not completed. So we can check if it's true or false in here. Now this works pretty fine, but we can also use a question mark to query our boolean. This will look for if it's true or not. And if it's true, appear in if, and if it's not true, it will fail. Okay, now here is a new variable called courses complete. And in here, we're adding +1 to it. But there actually is a better way to write this. What you want to do is you want to use set. You want to set it, and then you want to do equals, and we'll do courses complete again, and then +1. Now set is a very useful thing that can only be used with variables. Basically what we're doing here is we're making courses complete equal to the courses complete +1. So essentially, we're just adding 1 to it. But let's be honest, this is quite long, so there's a quicker way we can do this. If we just get rid of this, what we can do is we can do plus equal to 1, and that's the exact same thing we just made. And you can do this with all other math operators like minus or multiply or divide. Set can also be used to actually set the number to really anything you want. If you wanted to reset courses complete back to 0, you can do something like set courses complete equal to 0. Or if you want to make it 10, we can do 10, or how many this is. 10 plus 1 multiplied by 5. Know what I mean? So yeah, pretty cool, pretty useful. Now in verse, to write a comment, you can see it up here. You can use a hashtag. And hashtag is how you write a comment, and this is basically a way you can do little comments like saying this does this or something. Or you can also use it to make so code doesn't run if you didn't want it to run for some reason. You can do that as well. Another way you can use comments. So we can make an inline comment. So let's say I want to make a comment here for some reason. We do this here, inline comment, do this, and then this. So now we have a comment inside of a line that isn't affecting anything. And we can make inline comments by we can do something like this, where we can do this, we can go blah, 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 blah. We can go down, and then we can do this. So now we have an inline comment where we can really run whatever we want in here. It'll work fine. And then lastly, for comments, we can do indented comments. So we do shift enter, and then we can literally write anything we want in here, and it's indented comments. And in this indent, we're gonna be chilling. We can write whatever we want. Next up is loops, okay? And let's say if we want to make a loop, we want to write loop, and then colon, then we do shift enter. Now we're inside a loop. And then inside a loop, I guess we'll just print something. We can print, and then another thing we can do is we can sleep for maybe 4 seconds. And sleep, basically what that does is it will stop the code from moving. It'll basically suspend the code. And that's how many seconds it will do it for. This is a built-in function into verse, so I'll explain how that all works later. Then lastly, we might do set apples plus equals to 1. So every single time this loop goes, apples will increase by 1. Now this will loop the code, so this is going to happen over and over and over again forever. Now chances are you probably want to stop it at some point. So what we can do is add in a statement saying we can do if apples is equal to 10. Then we do this. We'll do a special expression named break, and which will break the loop. So now this loop will go 10 times over until apples is equal to 10, which will then the loop will break and it will stop. Now again, with sleep, that means it'll suspend the code, meaning it's going to take time to do something. And we need to wait for the loop to end, do the next thing after it. So let's say we have something like down here. We'll need to wait for the loop to finish to do it. There is a way around this with functions, which I'll get into later in this video, and a really important thing called concurrency. But right now, another thing that's really cool is arrays. An array is a data structure consisting of a collection of elements, or it's basically just a place where you want to store a list of things. And by the way, I want to thank pi=3 for this great tutorial on arrays. The documentation is very bad, so I kind of saved my life here. So yeah, but anyways, okay, here we're going to make an array. We're going to call it numbers, then we're going to do type, and in type we're going to do square brackets because it's going to be an array, so it's int. We're going to do equals to an array, and then we'll do inside here is our elements of the array. So we do 1, we want to do a little like thing here, 2, and then 3. Now we have an array with a bunch of elements, which is 1, 2, and 3, all of type int, and the array name is numbers. Now we made this int, but you can also make other arrays that are different types, like this one, which is string. And we can store character names or something, whatever we want. So here we're storing different character names. Okay, now, elements in an array are ordered in the same position in an array as you inserted them. And we can access the elements at their position, called the index, in the array. The first element in an array always has an index of 0, then it goes up to 1, and then 2, and then it increases by 1, so on and so forth. So let's say if we wanted to grab the first thing here. So basically, to get what we want to make a variable. We're going to call it first character of type string, and then we're going to equal that to character names, And then to get the index, we want to do square brackets, and we do the index number, which is 0, because that's the first one. And then we run into an error. Why does that happen? Why can't we just make it var equal to character names 1? This is because in verse, everything is an expression, meaning something must have an output. Now, some of these are called failable expressions, meaning that they can fail, which is not good for your code. So what we need to do is create a failure context, where we can fail all we like with no problems. Now, inside an if statement is the perfect place for that, as nothing bad will happen anyways. So just put this inside of an if statement like that. So now if there is a first element, that will make our variable first character that, which in this case would be Jerry. So now if you wanted to, we can go down here and we can print first character. And since this is a string, we don't have to do interpolation. And now this will print out Jerry. So yeah, that's how you would get the index. So if I were to do, I could also do something like this, where I could do another if, whoops, 1 second, let me get the indentation right. We could do second character in here. I'm gonna print second character. Like at the second character, it's going to be Joe. So that's going to be index of 1. That's how we would grab an element using the index out of the array. And now another thing you can also do is concatenate arrays, aka just adding stuff into it. So first we want to do set character names, and this is a variable, equal to character names plus the array of whatever elements we want. So I'm going to add Cripply to it. And now this is going to give us a little warning because this is not a variable, so we just do a little var at the front. Now this is also giving a warning because I did the wrong brackets. Let me just, there we go. Okay. So now we're going to be adding Cripply to the array. So now Cripply will become the 4th element in the array, or of index 3. Now this puts it at the end, but let's say if you wanted to insert something directly into the array, so let's say if you want to put something in the 2nd spot, or the 1st spot or something, you want to use the inbuilt insert function. Now to do this, what we need to do is we're going to do if, then we're going to do temp array, because this is going to be a temporary array we're not going to need anymore. We're going to do colon equals character names dot insert. We're going to use square brackets because this is a failable, this is a failable function, okay? But you know, it doesn't matter. We'll do 0, which is the index we want, and then we're going to do the array of the elements that we want to insert inside. So we're going to do Cripply. Let's say we might do Creplo, and then now inside this if we do a colon at the end, we're now going to be inserting at index 0 the array of Cripply and Creplo. So now they will go like right here in the array. So now Cripply will be now index 0, Creplo will be index 1, Jerry will be index 2, Joe will be 3, Carl will be 4. Oh yeah, and this is me from the future. I completely forgot. You need to make your character names array equal to the temporary array. That will complete the process. So that's how you would insert something into an array. Now, if you don't know what I did here, this 0 and then this array here, these are called arguments, okay? And it's inside a function and there can be arguments. Don't worry about it. Because right now, next up is functions. Okay, essentially, a function is a piece of reusable code that provides instructions for performing an action and provides different outputs based on the input you provide. For example, to make a function, we're going to do a function called print text. We'll do brackets, colon, void equals print text. This is a function called print text, and in that function we're printing a string with text in it. Now where you write this isn't very important, depending on which class or whatever. For now, we're going to write it inside the device class, so keep it inside here. Don't put it into here. You want to kind of keep on the same line as on begin. Okay, and then in our code to call our function, what we can do, it'll just type print text brackets, and now we've called our function. So when we do this, it's going to reference back to our function we just made up here, and it's going to do the job inside of it, which is printing text. Now, if you're wondering what void means, in this area is where you define the return type. Since there's nothing to return right now, the type is void, like the void is space, so like nothing. There's nothing to return. So you want to use void if you're not going to be returning anything. Okay, now, next up. If you remember from that if statement with the arrays from earlier, with the index and the array inside of it, those are called parameters. But how do parameters work? Okay, first, I'll make a string called orange. This is going to be our orange string. And then I'm going to make a function, remember, not inside on begin. And in this function, I'm going to grab fruit. And then inside this brackets, this is where I want my parameters. So whatever I want to infer in my function, I'm going to put in here. So I'm going to make a parameter called fruit. I'm going to have a string. Then we're going to do colon, void equals, then in here, do print. And then we're going to collected fruits, and we're going to interpolate our fruit we put up there inside of here. And now we've made a function that has a parameter of fruit that's of type string, and whatever that is in the input, in print, it's going to print it inside of there, so we collected fruit. Then what we want to do is we want to make another function. This is for when we, let's say, grab an orange, for example. We're going to do, it'll be of type void, and in here, it's going to do the function we just made called the grab fruit. We're going to call our function, but inside of it, we're going to include orange. Now, what this is doing, okay, is grab fruit is taking in a fruit. Now this fruit can be anything, and this fruit is inside here, and it's taking orange, and remember it's of type string, and orange up here is orange of type string, and it's gonna be the string called orange. So when we call it in grab orange, the grab fruit is going to infer orange, which is this string, inside of here, which then is going to be this fruit. So it's going to take the place of this fruit, and then when it's print, it's going to say collected orange, because now orange is now fruit, because we put orange here, which inferred it as fruit, so now its fruit is now orange. Does that make sense? Now hence, we can make more functions and use the same grab fruit function, but input different values into the same parameter. So for example, if I make another thing called apple, I can then make another function called grabbed apple, for example. In here I can do void equals grab, what happened here? That disappeared. Orange. You grab fruit, apple. And now we can have two different things that work perfectly with this one function here, because whatever the fruit is whatever this is inside of when we're calling the function. So for example, if we played grab orange, the output will be collected orange. If we played grab apple, the output would be collected apple. And also you can pass in as many parameters as you like. So we can do other fruits is a type of string, and then when we're actually calling our thing, we're going to do orange, and then we do this, and then we're going to be getting our other parameter, which is other fruits. So whatever we want that to be, we do apple, so the other fruit will be apple or something. You can do it like that. You write it like that. That's essentially how parameters work. Now, and after all of this, we can then do grabbed apple down here. If we subscribe that to like an event on a function or on a device, we can then play that. Now, okay, I know this is a lot of work for not much, but it's very important to understand when your code starts to get very long. Now, okay, you could write everything in onBegin down here, but this will eventually end up with a lot of bugs, so try your best to use functions. Now, if I delete all this, there's another way we can do functions. If I make a variable called completed level, then I'm going to make it of type logic. I want to equal it to false. I can then make a function called hasPlayer completed level. Remember, I do this. Then instead of making a type void, I'm going to make the return type logic. And now if I do this, I can return different types of logic. So if I do if completed level equal to true, we can then return true. And then let's say if it's not right, we can do return false. Here, we're basically making a variable called completed level with type logic that's equal to false. Now, we can make this true, it doesn't matter, but we change it back and forth from true. Here's a function that is called the true or false question we want to ask. And the question is, has the compiler complete the level or not? And then if you remember, we put our return type here, which is logic, as we want it to return either true or false, depending on what happens and what we test. Then inside the function, what we can do is then we'll see if the players complete the level using this if statement. And if it's equal to true, we'll return true. And if it's not, we'll return false. Now return is very important as that'll let us return an answer. And oh yeah, while we're here, I forgot, in if statements, you can also add in another thing called else if. We can test for other things before we do return a false. So if you want to do that, you can. I forgot to mention that. I can have as many else ifs as you want. Okay, anyways. Okay, now we have our function with logic and we're returning a value. So how do we actually get the return value? How do we actually use that value to do something? So to actually get the value, we're going to go into onBegin. We're going to make a variable called completed or whatever we want. And then we do type logic, we'll do equal to hasPlayer complete level, and we'll do brackets. So now basically we can bring the return value from this function into this new variable called completed. And then after this, we can do something like if completed equals true, print level is complete, and then else print level is not complete. There we go, perfect. To be honest with you, you don't need to make it this complex, as this is pretty simple. But this is really good to know when your code gets more complex later on. Functions effectively allow us to modularize our code to make it flow and work better, replicate and reuse code, and reduce the chance of bugs. Okay, now after all of this, we just talked about functions. Functions have one more important thing. It's time for concurrency. Okay, to start off with concurrency, we're gonna go back to our original example. Print. We're gonna do print text void equals sleep. We're gonna sleep it for maybe 5 seconds, and then we're gonna do print for text. Now, okay, you probably already noticed this is getting an error. We can't use sleep. Okay, now what is happening here? Why can't we just use this function and make it sleep for a bit? Okay, to explain this simply, verse requires everything to be completed in one frame coming from top to bottom. But some things like sleep here can suspend the code or stop it for a few seconds, which goes against that rule. Now the issue why this doesn't work inside a function, inside this function specifically, let's say if we did something like this inside onBegin, we're going to have a variable, we're making a variable, but then we're going to call our thing, and then we're going to set a number. Now remember, verse is trying to do everything in one frame. First we declare a variable called number, then we call our function, then we set the number. The issue with this is that inside our function, there is a sleep, and that stops the code. But if the code needs to complete in one frame, that's going to be impossible with how this works. That's because the function is missing a very important specifier named suspends. What we need to do is we need to go up here, click right here, we do this, we do suspends, and now, look at that, it worked. Now there are a few specifiers you can use on functions, but for now, suspend is all we're going to need and use. To explain this simply, and this is very important, there are two types of functions: synchronous or immediate functions that look like this, or asynchronous functions which look like this. Synchronous functions abide by the rule of completing in one frame or immediately, so they do not require the suspend and they can continue on as they please. However, asynchronous functions don't abide by that rule and have certain things that suspend the code, like sleep. It is extremely important you put the specifier of suspends on any function that will take time to complete. But even after all this, you may run into another issue. Let's say inside of a synchronous function, we wanted to call an asynchronous function, like this function up here. If you try it, as you can see, it won't work, because again, the rule or whatever. Now, to be able to actually call asynchronous functions inside of synchronous functions, there's a special expression we can use: spawn. To use it, you want to just type spawn and then do curly brackets around the function you want to use, or you can write it like this. We do a spawn and then we go down and then we can put our function in there. Now, spawn is really special as it's the only unstructured concurrency expression in verse, meaning it can allow a function to complete its task even after it's been called, and also even after it's been killed or it's been like passed or whatever. This will basically allow us to have asynchronous functions inside of synchronous functions. This is very important to know, so just remember this when you're working in functions. And that's about it for functions. Okay, next up to get our hands dirty is modules. If you look at the top of our screen, there's a lot of these things with using and then a bracket and then a little link. Basically, these are modules that are in the Verse API that let us use some functions and classes pre-made by Epic to help us out. I left a link in the description where you can find all of the different modules you can use in the Verse API. And good thing is there's a lot of stuff inside here already if you don't use the empty template. For example, Fortnite.com/devices lets us use devices. Verse org simulation, this is where we get players or the aging class. The sleep function, or get simulation elapsed time, see how many seconds the game has been going on for. UnrealEngine.com/temporary, where we can find things like scene graph functionality for components, UI stuff like canvas, buttons, etc. And spatial math, which is extremely useful for things like getting rotations, transforming, and vectors. A few more include Fortnite.com/vehicles. You can use Fortnite.com/teams. Fortnite.com/game is good for making objects damageable or not, or something like that. Characters is how you get the fourth character, and there's a lot more of these where we can browse through. Oh, and okay, there we go. That's modules. Okay, now we've learned many things so far, but how do we actually use all of this stuff in UEFN? I'm just going to go and we're going to start off with a new file. We're going to go into content, we're going to create a new verse file. We're going to make a device that will be able to grant the player some gold. So we're going to call it the gold_granter_device. We're going to create, once we do this, if we go back into VS Code, we go into our new file up here, gold granter. We now have, you know, a basic verse file. So what we're gonna do first is I'm just gonna clean up this. I'm gonna get rid of this, anything on begin, and I'm gonna add brackets. There we go. Okay, now in the default file, as you can see, we have our modules up here and an onBegin function that will run when the game starts. There's also our gold granter device, which is of class creative device. Now, classes is a video in themselves, okay? But for now, we'll work inside of our device class here. Now, like I said before, we need to use devices in UEFN to control our verse code. To do that, we're going to make a constant named item grantor, but its type is going to be of class item underscore grantor underscore device. It's gonna be equal to item underscore grantor underscore device curly brackets, and just put some brackets inside on begin to make it so it doesn't bug out for now. Okay, now with this made, click this button in the top right of VS Code right up here to build our verse code. It should be built successfully. Then after you do that, go into UEFN, go into content drawer, and we should see our gold grantor device verse class right here. And to use this, what we need to do is we need to drag it out into our scene. And here it is. This is our verse device. Go into details. As you can see in details, we'll have visible game, enable game start, but there's nothing else. So how are we supposed to get an item grantor inside of this? Okay, inside our verse code, we need to add in something very important, editables. In front of our constant, we're going to add @editable, and this is going to turn this constant into a variable that's editable. So now doing this will allow us to reference an item grantor device, or really anything you want, depending on what type you define here, inside UEFN into the verse code. So to see this, build our code by pressing this, save selected, and then once it's built, you're now going to see we now have, in our gold grantor device, we now have an item grantor, and we can edit it. So what we want to do next is we want to go into our content drawer, we want to go into Fortnite, we want to find an item grantor, and we'll find it in here, the item grantor device, and we'll bring it in. Then with this device, inside the settings of the device, we're going to do onGrant action, keep all. We're going to do all items in here. We're going to grant some gold, do gold, and then we're going to do enable game start, and it's fine. If you're familiar with Fortnite Creative, all of this will be familiar to you, and with devices. If you're not, just see what I'm doing here. Receiving player, I'm going to make it triggering player, and then all this should be good. So yeah, here we go. Here's the little item grantor we just made. Then we're gonna click back into our verse device. Now here we can click here, and then we can find our item grantor here, and we put it in. It's gonna filter all the item grantor devices in your map. We get our item grantor. Or you can press this little dropper and click on it right here, and it'll also work. So now our item grantor, or this device, is now referenced inside of our verse device. So now back in our code, our item grantor device is now the item grantor. Now, just for example, you can control anything using editable. Okay, now here's a bunch of editables I've added in. Now you can use ints, you can use floats, you can use strings, you can use logic, you can also use arrays, and you can also do arrays of devices too. So if I were to build this, it's gonna build. Now you're gonna see we can now change numbers. So this number is an int, so we can change the int. This float, we can change it to like whatever we want. This string, we can change it to something like hello. We can change the logic to true or false, so it's gonna be a check mark. Then we have an array of ints. So we can change the ints inside here, and we can have an array of triggers too. So we can hook up trigger devices, which would be this device, the trigger device. So in here we can hook up as many trigger devices as we want, depending on what we want in our code. It's extremely useful. And now another thing you can also do is clamping. So if we want to make a clamp, we want to do editable but clamp. We're gonna do an int. Now we're gonna use a special thing called type. And we're gonna infer. We do underscore x is type int, where underscore x is greater than or equal to 0, and underscore x is less than or equal to 10, and then we'll do with a 1. So now if we build this, go out, save, see we have a clamped int, and it's gonna be clamped to a number. So we can only pick a number from 0 to 10. So if you want to do that, you can. Okay, but anyways, this was probably for an example. I'm going to delete all of this, and we're going to go back to what we had. Okay, so if you remember from the start of the video, I'm talking about how devices have pre-built functions and events inside the digest of verse. To access and see what devices can do, we want to hold control on our keyboard. We want to hover over the device, like item grantor, click, and that's going to open up the digest, and it's going to bring us to where the item grantor is inside the digest. And in here, we can see different events, like item granted event, enable, disable. What we want is grant item. This is a built-in function for the item grantor device. Now there's also grant item to all. In between grant item here and grant item to all, you're going to notice a difference. In grant item, you're going to need something called an agent of type agent in the parameters of the grant item function. When in grant item to all, we don't need it. Okay, to understand this, for grant item, we need to pass in an agent of type agent. An agent is just like a player, and grant item prefers to be used with only one person. And this is important. In item grantor, if you have the option of receiving players is triggering player is the agent in this case. So the triggering player would be the agent. So if we only want to grant the item to the triggering player, we need an agent. And then since granting items to all doesn't need the triggering player because it's granting items to everybody, we don't need an agent because we don't need a single player that we're only gonna have it for. Okay, we're gonna go back to our gold granter device. We'll actually close that. And we're going to make a new function, and this is gonna be called give player gold. We're just gonna do this. And inside of this function's parameters, remember we're gonna need an agent, so we're going to add an agent of type agent. So we're going to pass in an agent of type agent. So now next what we need to do is we're going to get our item granter, which is the name of here of our item granter. We're going to add a period, and then we're going to do our function or method that we want to call, which is grant item, remember, and then we're going to do brackets, and then we need to pass in our agent, which is this guy. So we're going to do agent. So when the function give player gold is played, it's going to pass in an agent, and then the item granter is going to grant the item to that agent that got passed in. Now, okay, for this example, just what we're going to do is we're going to reference another device. We're going to make another editable, and we're going to reference a button. We're going to call it button underscore device equal button, not device, tab, and squirrely brackets. There we go. And now again, if we can hold control and click on button device, we'll find the digest. And what we need to do is we find the event called interacted with event, and we can listen to it, and it's going to pass in an agent too. And now this is a listenable event, so we can listen for this in our code. So now if we go back into our item granter, in on begin, we're going to grab our button, then we're going to get the interacted with event. We're going to type in the event we want to listen to, so interacted with event. Then we're going to use a special thing called subscribe. We're going to subscribe something to when we hear that event. And in brackets, we're going to put our function that we want to play when that interactive event happens, which is give player gold. So we're going to put in give player gold. And voila! Now when the button is interacted with, it should pass in the agent of who pressed the button into here, and then it's going to grant the item to the agent that was passed in here using the grant item function. Then if we go build our code, and then last step, we actually just need a button. So we gotta go in content drawer. We're gonna grab a button, which is this, a button device, put it right here, do free gold, and then we're going to give it interaction delay, maybe 1 second, and then we'll put it there. So now with this button, then go into our device. We're going to now do the same thing that we did with the item granter. We're going to select the button device. You look at that, we got a button. Now when we press this button, this is not the button that's in here. So now when the button gets interacted, it's going to subscribe this function. It's going to pass in the agent, aka the person who pressed the button, and then the item granter is going to grant an item to the agent, which is inside of here. The item would be gold, so it's going to give the player gold. So now we launch session, and now in game, if we click this button, would you look at that? Every time we press the button, I'll get a bit of gold. Oh yeah, this works. Okay, now this is all I'm going to cover in this video, but hopefully you now understand a bit better of how Verse actually works. Some tips for any beginners would be to learn all the devices in the game, and as they are their backbone when it comes to doing things inside your game in Verse. Another one would be just to experiment. The best way to familiarize yourself with Verse is to work with it, and over time you'll start to remember the syntax or certain things like when it puts its hands on a function or how devices work, stuff like that. Now this video is only the tip of the iceberg. In upcoming videos, I'll go over more topics like classes, maybe UIs, AI behavior, and scene graph components later on in the future. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you like, subscribe, and use my code in the Fortnite shop. And thank you to all our members of the channel. Become a member of the Howtwoboss channel today for some cool perks. And watch all of these videos for more of my content. That's about it. I'll see you all around.